Welcome to the Write Good Books podcast, the audio companion to WriteGoodBooks.com, with your host Jason Bougger.
Hey, welcome back to the podcast. It's Jason here, and this week Scott and I just couldn't get our schedules to match up, so much like Marty Jannetty without Shawn Michaels or Jim the Anvil Neidhart without Bret Hart, I'm on my own this week. So I'm going to take advantage of that and do a little self-critique. Now, normally I would say you shouldn't read unpublished fiction publicly or apologize for your work, but that is exactly what I'm going to do right now. So let's go back a few years to a Rocky Mountain fiction writing conference I attended in Denver. I showed up ready to pitch and sell Holy Fudgesicles. Easy as pie, right? Well, wrong. First, I attended a workshop put on by Sharon Mingery. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, Sharon. But it was a workshop on how to prepare your first 25 pages. And after that workshop, I pretty much cut my first 25 pages, which is, I don't know, both good and bad, I guess, since I did eventually sell the book. But what I'd like to do this week is share a few of those 25 pages that were cut and let you know why they were cut. So it might be a little embarrassing, but I hope we all learn from it. We'll start right away with the opening. So here we go. Bear with my reading skills, but it should be fun. So this is page 1, chapter 1 of the opening chapter that was cut from the novel. I rarely found it acceptable to stereotype an entire group of people, but if there was ever a time where such a thing was okay, it was on Sunday mornings, sitting in a church pew watching the way everyone sat, stood, and knelt in unison made me feel almost obligated to label them as nothing but a group of brainwashed zombies. Okay, that was my first paragraph, and I think that's mostly terrible. The biggest problem that I have with it is, well, one, you are stereotyping a whole group of people, and I'm not a big fan of, scaring away your audience right away. But also the brainwashed zombies is kind of a cliche. You know, it puts a setting there. You're in church. Let's go to the next paragraph. I wondered how my parents could be so cruel as to force me to participate in these theatrics every week. God must have woken up on the wrong side of the bed the day he decided to pair me up with them, or maybe he just had a really warped sense of humor. You know, the kid's sitting there, the narrator, the kid is sitting there with his parents. Terrible analogy. So let's keep going. We just returned from the communion line, and they're still kneeling, so neither one of them noticed me slipping my phone out of my back pocket as I sat down. While everyone continued to sing the awful song, How Great Thou Art, I clicked through the menu and went back to the level of Angry Birds I'd been stuck on for the last couple of days. I exhaled as I watched the level scroll before my eyes. I could feel it. This time, I'll shut up those stupid little green pigs. Dad nudged me lightly in the arm, pulling my attention away from my phone, and raised an eyebrow from under his glasses. That was his shut up and be quiet look. It was pretty ironic considering he had to be just as bored as I was, assuming he had a brain in his head. I glared at him for a second, then rolled my eyes and mouthed the word sorry. He held out his hand, and I reluctantly handed over my phone. That sets the tone of the narrator's kind of little disrespectful, kind of snarky, but the language is just kind of awful. I wonder how they'd be so cruel to force me to participate in these theatrics every week. Real people don't talk like that. That was a big reason I cut that. Let's read on a little bit here. Finally, the song was over, and after a few more prayers, I heard the words I had spent the last hour waiting for. The masses ended. Go in peace. Well, that tells you he's sitting in a Catholic church if you didn't get that already. I jumped up in the pew in a fraction of a second before everyone else and shouted, Hallelujah. This time it was my mom nudging me in the arm. She was nowhere near as gentle as Dad. So his mom's a little ruder, his dad's a little whatever. Or his mom's a little stricter, his dad's a little more lenient, I guess. That was the first page. You know what? I'll read on just a little bit more to show how I introduce all these characters. Let's skip ahead here. Sorry, blah, blah, blah. Okay, he sees the priest and his entourage walk down the aisle past us. My buddies Zach and Mike were part of that entourage. since they were still suckered into doing the altar boy thing. Mike had already grown to the point that they no longer had a robe large enough for him. The fact that he insisted on wearing shorts everywhere he went made him look like he was prancing down the aisle wearing a miniskirt. Okay, to be honest, I kind of like that line. Zach was a full head shorter than Mike. He walked next to him while lip-singing the foul words of the final song. His dirty blonde hair stood up in 2 places, and it was really obvious that he had gotten out of bed approximately 3 minutes before church started. I gave them the 1-finger salute by slowly and obviously sticking out my middle finger and sliding it over my nose, pushing up my glasses. Zach pretended like he didn't see it and continued to lip-sing while Mike bit his lips, trying his damnedest to hide the grin that was forcing its way onto his face. Father Hurley saw the gesture, but unlike Zach, didn't pretend that he didn't see it. He stopped singing long enough to give me a stern look before the phony smile returned to his gray goatee, and he resumed the song. So, that first 2 pages, you introduce the narrator, his mom, his dad, his 2 best friends, and the priest. That right there is 5 characters in 1 page. That's a little much, and I'll go on for just a second here. Let's see. We'll skip that. He talks about, gives a little bit of history of why he doesn't like church. It's boring. They finally go outside. He mounts off to the priest a little bit and goes sits with his friends, makes fun of them for being altar boys, and a few more characters are introduced. Okay, so instead of reading that, so let's go on to the next page. It all just reinforced how happy I was to be done with the stupid altar boy stuff. My parents made a deal with me. As long as I kept doing it without complaining until I entered high school, they'd let me decide whether or not I'd continue serving in church after that. Since the school had just gotten out for the summer that Wednesday, I was officially a 9th grader. That meant I was finally in high school and my life as an altar boy could come to a close. I had earned the privilege of ignoring the part of the church bulletin that had my name listed to serve next weekend. Okay, another problem there. If his mom is so strict about church, why are they letting him not be an altar boy? Because anyone who was an altar boy knows that that's not the case. After an eternity, the song ended and the people started shuffling out. There was one positive about going to church at 8 in the morning, and it was once you got it out of the way, you had the whole rest of the day ahead of you. I squeezed around the grandmas and made my way toward the door, leaving my parents as far behind as possible. "How they hangin', Padre," I said to Father Hurley, loud enough for him to know I said something, but not loud enough for him to know what I said, as I walked outside. I sat down on the edge of the steps and watched people walk around me while I waited to see Zach and Mike pop up through the crowd. Every blue-haired old lady who passed by me either scowled at me with anger or shook her head with disappointment. Every scowl was met with a sardonic smile and a "God bless you, ma'am," in the best old English accent I could conjure up. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. Let me finish this page. Mom and Dad walked out with Odessa Dimmitt, my 1st grade teacher. She was probably an okay person as far as teachers go, but to the kids of Fairfield Elementary, she'll always be remembered as Professor Dimwit. The dye job in her poofy hair looked almost as bad as her botched plastic surgery, and way too early for summer fake tan. I suppose I should feel sorry for her since she lost her husband a few years ago, but witnessing her 62 going on 42 transformation was both creepy and depressing at the same time. That was the end of page 3, and, I cut this whole church scene because a lot of it was filled with pointless observations from the narrator, and it doesn't really propel the story. And okay, so he's snarky. He's snarky and he's a little bit mouthy. In future revisions, I kind of toned that down just because I don't write snark very well, as you can tell after listening to 10 minutes of this. I think I'll skip a little bit ahead to where he meets his friends and show you some dialogue that I got cut. Here we go. His friends come out of the church then. He says, "Hey, losers," I said. "Hey yourself, dumbass," Zach said and sat down next to me. "What's going on?" "Not one goddamn thing. No matter how many times I said it, I still felt a perverse satisfaction in saying, "God damn, so close to church." Did you guys have fun waxing your candles? Mike fake slugged me in the shoulder. I'll wax your candle. I fake blocked his fake punch and then fake punch him back in the jaw. It's way too big for you to handle, I said with a smirk. Okay, I wanted to share that because I think that dialogue is atrocious. And I cut this whole scene because nothing really happens in it, and it's not a good way to introduce your novel. Let me scroll down a little bit and then I'll talk more about it. Okay. So basically, the kids decide they're going to go play D&D after lunch, and it goes for 2 more pages of just them kind of talking about nothing and where they're going to play, and the chapter ends with the narrator saying, "I'll see you guys after lunch. Oh, and one more thing, I think it'd be great if you guys wore your swag altar boy dresses," which I guess that's a good enough line. Okay, so to go a little more in depth with why I cut that whole first chapter, and then the rest of it, I kept bits and pieces of the further chapters of the first 25 pages, but I scattered them out. So that the problem with that whole first chapter is nothing happens. It was just there to introduce the characters and, try to show the personality of the narrator, that he's a little snarky, a little mouthy. His friends are kind of there. They don't have a whole lot of personality in this first chapter. So it introduces way too many people. It doesn't differentiate enough to justify them being there. And it does everything that now I don't think a first chapter should do. A first chapter should give you the character, what he wants, why he wants it, and give you a hint of, the quest he's going on, he or she, to get to the end of the novel. All this one did was give a bunch of filler, a bunch of bad dialogue, and there's nothing in that first chapter to make anyone want to keep reading. So these are the things to look out for in your first chapter. Just too much setup. So what I learned in the workshop that made me cut this first chapter in its entirety was, we go into the workshop and Sharon says the first thing she asked us was, ask yourself where your story starts. Everybody kind of looks around like, well, at the first word. But she said, no, think about what your story actually is and what's happening, and then draw a line. So that's what we did. And you go through and you draw that line, and I say, wow, my story didn't start till like page 22. Everything else I had was, this dumb church scene and just pointless dialogue between the characters trying to introduce the characters to the readers. And it just didn't come off as authentic. So in Holy Fudgesicles, for example, the story for me actually starts when the narrator gets hit by a bus. So she went through and showed us how to, start the story at as close to that point as you can. And then anything else that happened that was somewhat important, you can spread out later throughout the book. And that was what I did. In the published version, there's no church scene at all, and the characters are introduced just as needed. The first scene only introduces the 3 main characters, and then the important event happens. You highlight the inciting incident. It's where you have the character's life, and then something happens, and everything changes. So in this book, as I said, it was when the main character gets hit by a bus. So you want that inciting incident to happen as early in the novel as possible, because otherwise you're just going to be reading a lot of filler, and perhaps you might think this post or this episode was a lot of filler. I hope not. I hope you learned a little bit. And that seems like a good enough place to stop. So if you'd like to support the podcast, check out our Patreon site at patreon.com/writegoodbooks. And feel free to visit us on the web at writegoodbooks.com if you'd like to leave any feedback. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.